Okay, so go back here. We are in the steppes of Siberia, making of a Russian Empire. Let's look at the steppes of Siberia. After the Mongol rule, Moscow became the center of a vast Russian empire. Remember, the Mongols were awesome in spreading out culture. They got it from the Persians, which are kind of down here. And then, of course, they came up into this area as well. This is part of the Golden Horde, a big, big area. So you've got Moscow, Novgorod, St. Petersburg, Kiev. These are all areas that we've heard of before. And Moscow is going to be the center of the Russian Empire, like the massive thing. Most people don't live in Siberia because it's primarily ice, and so you don't see that necessarily as inhabited. But this is primarily like our biggest Russian area, and they go out to the east later. Then we have the Cossacks. So the Cossacks, basically in the vanguard of Russian expansion across Siberia, which is that area we just looked at, that place that I said was all ice, were the Cossacks. They were fiercely independent warriors consisting of peasants who'd escaped serfdom. Remember that I talked about we had to have labor systems, and we needed to know like the Mita and the encomienda and the hacienda and slavery and feudal system and manorial system. And then now we have the also the peasants who escaped from serfdom. So serfdom is another one. Serfdom is very similar to like feudalism in Europe. So these people escape that. Okay. Also, they brought criminals with them. So, you know how that works. So the criminals, they all are out there becoming this basically warriors. The 16th century Cossack is known as a Yermak, and he is shown leading his troops. Now, imagine that you have people who have escaped serfdom. They're also criminals. So you can imagine that they were probably not far off Mongol type people, maybe not quite so bad, but also not so good.
For months, Catherine, together with one of her lovers, had been working with men high in government and the military to replace what they all saw as a disastrous and incompetent emperor, Peter. They'd been slowly putting out bribes and winning the hearts of the local guard regiments in St. Petersburg, but on the night of June 27th, it all came to a head due to a slip of the tongue. June 27th, 1762. A soldier in one of the guard regiments in St. Petersburg gets spooked. He turns to one of his officers and asks if it's true that the conspiracy against the emperor has been found out. Turns out the officer he just asked is one of the few who was not in on the plot. The soldier is arrested on the spot, as is one of the guard officers who is central to the rebellion. The time is now or never. The revolt must begin. The principal conspirators gather, panicked. A man named Panin, a man who would go on to be one of Catherine's highest officials, stays them, saying their freedom could only be assured for a few hours, so they must act, and they must act now. The brother of Catherine's paramour is dispatched to Peterhof, the palace outside of St. Petersburg where Catherine's staying. He dashes out and pulls aside the first carriage he can find. Money makes the driver push the horses hard through the night. Meanwhile, Peter is asleep at Oranienbaum, a small post outside of Petersburg where he's staying to observe one of his regiments before his Danish adventure. The brother of Catherine's lover arrives just as Catherine is waking at 5 a.m. The time has come, he says. He quickly relays the night's event. Skipping all the elaborate dress of a high lady of the time, Catherine immediately rushes to the carriage. The horses are exhausted from the travel of the previous night, but as they are crawling down the road toward the capital, a farm wagon on its way to morning market passes. They stop it, and the Empress consort pushes money into the farmer's hand. She has his two great farm horses tethered to her carriage right then and there, and they speed towards St. Petersburg. Out in the drill yard, Peter is making his small contingent of Holstein soldiers parade before him. A messenger brings news of the arrest of the guards and the possible conspiracy. Peter shrugs it off. One by one, Catherine goes to the barracks of each of the guard units stationed in Petersburg. One by one, the regiments swear fealty to her in a jubilous tumult. Meanwhile, Peter is playing violin in his room. A man rushes in to tell him he has a message about happenings in the capital. Annoyed at the interruption, Peter tells the man to put it on the table. He'll read it later. He never does. Surrounded by guards, a procession with Catherine at its center makes its way to the Cathedral of Our Lady Kazan, where the Archbishop of Novgorod pronounces her sovereign autocrat of Russia. Meanwhile, Peter orders a caravan of carriages assembled to take him and his guest back to Peterhof to have a feast. He forgets to order the usual cavalry escort. Catherine and an ever-growing mob process to the Winter Palace. There she meets with assembled members of the Senate and the Holy Synod, the highest religious council of Russia. She declares that out of love for Russia and the Orthodox faith, she had been moved to such action, that at the urging of her subjects, against an emperor who imperiled them, she took the throne to deliver Russia from foreign powers and foreign religion. Which, bold move, considering she herself was a foreigner who had come to Russia with a foreign religion, but hey, nobody was really sweating the details at the time. Meanwhile, Peter's group of revelers arrive at Peterhof only to find no one there. Peter is furious. He storms through the house looking for Catherine. She's spoiled his party. To one of his entourage, he screams in rage at her unthinking discourtesy. Didn't I always tell you she was capable of anything? A few of the more senior members of the party offer to head to St. Petersburg to see if they can find her. They had probably put two and two together by this point. The embassy from Peter's company arrives. One of them begs Catherine not to take up arms against her husband. She takes him by the elbow and leads him to a balcony. Gesturing to the ecstatic crowd, she says, "Deliver your message to them." The small group of messengers all swear fealty to Catherine, or ask to be allowed to retire. Meanwhile, Peter has gotten his first concrete news of all the goings-on from the crew of a firework barge that was sailing to Peterhof to provide the fireworks for his party. But all their information is still vague because they had left early in the morning, as they'd been ordered to go deliver the fireworks. Peter, enraged, orders word to be sent to Oranienbaum to get his Holstein regiment. He shouts that he would defend himself to the death. His men arrive and are posted along the road to the capital, but no one thought to tell them that there might be a fight, so they only brought their wooden parade ground rifles. A Russian uniform is found for Peter, because he was still wearing the German one that he liked so much. His advisors gather around him. One counsels that he don the uniform, ride at full haste to the capital, and remind the people who they had sworn an oath to. Another recommends that he meet up with a larger contingent of the army 70 miles away, and then march on St. Petersburg. A third recommends he flee to Germany. He does nothing. Men are sent to secure a nearby island fortress. This fortress is still loyal. At least this was good news. Catherine had gotten the backing of the Synod, the people, the army, and the Senate without firing a shot. But there was one last thing she had to do. Peter had to formally abdicate. As was the right of the sovereign, she had taken on the rank of the colonel of the Preobrazhensky Guards. Borrowing pieces of a uniform from any of the men who seemed about her size, she strode out to meet her soldiers in the brilliant green of the Guards. She would lead the final foray to capture Peter herself. As the march began, a young subaltern rushed up to give her his sword knot, the one piece her uniform yet lacked. This subaltern's name, by the way, was Gregory Potemkin. Peter, meanwhile, chose to withdraw to the island fortress he had secured earlier in the evening. As his boat approached, the harbor was closed off to him. He shouted to the men in the fort, "Do you not know me? I'm your emperor." To which the reply came, "We no longer have an emperor. Long live Empress Catherine II." In the time between him sending his man to secure the fort and him choosing to finally go there, the top admiral of the Navy had sworn allegiance to the new empress and headed to the fort to take over its command personally. Peter fled into his cabin to hide. When he returned to Peterhof, he dismissed everyone and then went to his room, refusing to speak to his staff. Then he composed a letter to Catherine, apologizing for his bad behavior and offering to share the throne with her. At first light, Catherine receives Peter's letter. She is unimpressed. A few hours later, she receives another letter offering to abdicate if he could just go back to Holstein. She accepts. He writes an abject abdication statement detailing how unfit he is to rule. Needless to say, a few weeks later, he wound up dead in a drunken brawl that was probably a cleverly disguised assassination. And his idol, the man he kept telling himself he was equal to, Frederick the Great? Of the affair, Frederick merely said, he allowed himself to be dethroned like a child being sent to bed. And while Catherine probably had nothing to do with Peter being killed, she did pardon his killers, as his death freed her up to rule without the worry that someone would try and form a counter-rebellion around him. And rule she did, rapidly reversing almost all of Peter's policies. As Russian forces were literally on the verge of engaging with Denmark, riders arrived with Catherine's orders to return home. In fact, that was the order to all the Russian troops in Europe. She was going to begin an era of neutrality, where Russian troops fought on neither side of the 7 Years' War, and for this the army was forever grateful. The Church, on the other hand, was more complex. She put a temporary moratorium on Peter's order to secularize all church land, but Catherine was intent on being an informed ruler, and as reports came into her every day, one thing became more and more clear. Russia was broke. Grain prices were soaring, the treasury was filled with IOUs. Ending all the wars would help, but not seeing the reparations which might have been expected with a decisive victory, Russia was penniless and without any recourse to credit. And easily a tenth of all the wealth of Russia was locked up in church lands, wealth that her government needed. After a long back and forth with the Senate about the morality of a church which owned so much property but didn't help with the temporal affairs like charity and education, and with a few threats thrown in, Catherine was able to cow them. All church property became state property. More than 1 million church serfs became peasants, which meant they now had to pay taxes, and all church officials became employees of the state. And this shows the strength of Catherine. Where Peter lost one of the great pillars of the Russian state, and arguably his throne, for his policy, Catherine's iron will and careful management of the other elements of power allowed her to drag in this vast source of government revenue. But in doing so, it also brought up the other great issue for Catherine: serfs. Because serfs in Russia were slaves. They could be bought and sold, abused with no rights over their own bodies. They could be gambled away or traded. They had no choice but to work the vocation their master chose for them, and they couldn't move or leave the land that they were bound to. And with burgeoning industrial revolution, there came to be a new kind of serf. A serf not owned by a master, but owned by a corporation, many of whom were employed by the great mining enterprises of the Urals. And in these mines, life was ugly, brutish, and short. Because they were chattel, men were literally worked to death, beaten when they paused for a moment in their labor. This treatment caused riots and strikes that would eventually lead to the largest peasant revolt in Russian history. So join us next time for the plight of the serfs, the ghost of Peter III, and the Pugachev Rebellion.
Okay, so this is what's going to lead us up to the Cossacks. So we have them all rebelling. Again, they got out of the serfdom, they left it, also took some criminals with them. This is what we have. So, what were some of the causes of Russian expansion? Again, let's go back and let's look at how Russia expanded. I want to look at this map again. Let's look and see how Russia expanded. They went from basically this area here. We have Novgorod. We all know that that was probably one of the first ones. Novgorod and Kiev and Rus, because we have Kiev here. So this area was pretty much it. And they're going to expand all the way out here. The Russian expansion is going to mainly, the biggest Russian expansion is going to take place between 1598 and 1689. Okay. So what's going to cause this? Well, Russian expansion into the grasslands is going to be driven by the problem of security. Pastoral peoples of this region frequently raided Russian territory, selling many captives into slavery. Again, much like the serfdoms, they were also slaves. Russian expansion into Siberia was driven on demand of world market for pelts. Remember, that's almost like all frozen, so a lot of animals live there. And so getting that fur-bearing animals gave them some money. And so that was a really, really big deal. And we're going to see that go all the way into Canada, actually. Although later some agricultural settlement does take place there. All this is going to be made possible by weapons and organization. So let us check out another image here. Let's take a look at this image and see what we see. Who is riding the horses? So we've got the Cossacks here. And how are they so well organized? Well, remember when we talked about how Russia took on stuff from the Mongols, that they didn't really give the Mongols anything. They took a lot from the Mongols. Remember, the Mongols were very organized. think about where this location is, directly above Mongolia. So this is one of the areas of Russia that is going to, Russia's going to take a lot from the Mongols, which, remember, their bureaucracy and their organization were one of the biggest things that they had going for them. Their army of thousands, hundreds, tens, all of this organization is what is going to bring us and help out the Cossacks. What is an effect of this? Well, the Cossacks are going to end up bringing, the effects of the expansion is you're going to have a lot of epidemics, especially in the remote areas of Siberia. It's very similar to how when they came over to the Americas, you're exposed to smallpox and measles, and they had no immunity to this. In the image, we see here that the Cossacks are very brutal. Again, a little bit of Mongol there. People are going to join Russia to avoid the pressure of Christianity. That's going to be the main thing that they're going to do. Because over in Europe, they're like, Christianity, it's going, and they're trying to get people to do it. And here, they're like, no, thank you.
1645, and Tsar Michael of Russia is a bit dead. He was the first ruler of the Romanov dynasty and oversaw a pretty tumultuous time in Russia. He was succeeded by the young Alexis, who left most of the actual governing to a man called Boris Morozov, who was a boyar. What's a boyar? Well, they were high-ranking nobles who had previously wielded immense power, but were much reduced since the Romanovs came to power. Morozov was a competent, if not corrupt, bureaucrat, and he tried to raise more money for the government. Morozov would be thrown out of office by the Tsar in 1648 after he raised taxes on salt, which caused a riot. So Russia at this point had one glaring issue. It was economically backwards. It was mostly backwards in things like agriculture, which had made immense technical progress in other parts of Europe like the Netherlands and England. In Russia, however, agriculture made no progress and farming methods remained the same since there were loads of peasants and slaves to do the work. In 1649, though, Alexis issued a law code which freed all of the agricultural slaves in Russia and then made them serfs. He also sought to give better defined legal status to the agricultural peasants by making them serfs. Serfdom, being a serf, was a hereditary status which expressly tied you to the land of your lord. Previously, many peasants and slaves had fled their lords because agricultural work sucked. See, in Russia, a shortage of reasonable land wasn't an issue because Russia is huge. It was labour that was valuable, and so preventing the movement of serfs protected the wealth of the nobility and, of course, the Tsar. In terms of foreign policy, Alexis was quite peaceful. Just kidding, in 1654 he invaded the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which was suffering from its own instability. The Russians performed extremely well at first and occupied most of the country, which was then invaded by the Swedish too, because why not? Poland-Lithuania defeated the Swedish and started to turn the tide, but a civil war broke out and financial ruin forced them to sue for peace. Russia gained this territory, including the cities of Smolensk and Kiev, the latter of which was supposed to be only temporary, but fun fact, no. Alexis's reign also saw religious reform. Alexis believed that Russia was being punished because it was straying from the correct religious path. He thus sought to reform church practices with the help of the Patriarch of Moscow, Patriarch Nikon, the head of the Orthodox Church in Russia. This was, unsurprisingly, met with resistance from those who considered the changes to be too dramatic and too Western. And by Western, I mean that they were in line with the Ukrainian and Greek Orthodox churches, not like France or something. In 1668, a synod was called to formalise these changes. Those who resisted these new practices were excommunicated and became known as Old Believers. These Old Believers would represent a sizable schism in the Russian Orthodox Church for many more centuries. Alexis also had issues with revolt. One such revolt was led by a man called Stenka Razin, a Cossack who in 1670 had captured the city of Tsaritsyn and was pillaging literally everything. A series of peasant revolts coincided with this, and it took a year for the central Moscow government to quell the uprisings and eventually execute Razin. In 1676, Alexis shook off his mortal coil and was succeeded by his eldest son, Fyodor, who was crowned Fyodor III. So the young Fyodor was a good sponsor of the church and sought to strengthen its position whilst encouraging learning across the Tsardom. This was pretty much all he did, since he died at the ripe old age of 21 in 1682. This left two potential heirs to the throne: Alexis's eldest surviving son, Ivan, from his first wife, who was very sickly, and Peter, the healthy son of his second wife. Well, the supporters of Peter had him quickly proclaimed Tsar, which caused Ivan's supporters to riot. Ivan's supporters were aided by the Streltsy, the palace guard, who stormed the royal palace and basically murdered everyone who had ever wronged them. In the end, it was determined that both Ivan and Peter would be co-rulers, and that Ivan's sister, Sophia, would act as regent for them both. During his youth, Peter wasn't kept in Moscow, but sent to a place called Preobrazhenskoye, where he developed a love for the military and, in particular, a fascination with ships and navies. Sophia, who was aided by a man called Vasily Golitsyn, ruled throughout the 1680s with fair competence. She signed the Treaty of Eternal Peace with Poland in 1686, which did two things. 1. It signed Russia up to an anti-Ottoman alliance, and 2. Demonstrated that nobody knew what the term eternal meant. In 1689, Sophia came up with the great idea: let's crown me and depose the two Tsars. To the nobility and the Streltsy that had supported her, this was a step too far, and she was sent away to a convent for the rest of her life. This left both Ivan and Peter as joint rulers, but since Ivan was unable to rule, this made Peter the primary Tsar, although it was his mother who was really in charge until 1694, when she came down with a case of the deads. 2 years later, Ivan also died, meaning that all of Russia was finally Peter's. The first thing that Peter, or Peter I, did with his newfound freedom was what all great Russian leaders would do thereafter: invade the Ottoman Empire. Russia was already at war with the Ottomans as part of an alliance, but Peter made sure that there was a renewed effort at taking southern territory. This saw Russia gain this territory, Azov, which importantly gave it access to the sea in the south. So Peter was a very involved leader who took great pride in personally overseeing government reforms and projects. For example, in 1697 he launched what is called the Grand Embassy. This was where his diplomats travelled around Europe, securing new military technology and know-how, as well as strengthening the alliance against the Ottoman Empire. He travelled with this embassy personally, although for the most of it he was in disguise. He travelled to many countries across Europe, gaining valuable information, but had no luck with fighting the Ottomans. His Grand Embassy had to be cut short when the Streltsy started to revolt in Moscow. This was put down before Peter even returned to Russia, but afterwards all of those involved were severely punished. Peter had a strong distaste for the Muscovite way of life, i.e. he disliked many of the old ways of doing things. He took on a more European way of dress and abandoned the full beards that previous Russian leaders and the boyars had sported. You could opt not to, but then you'd have to pay a beard tax. Peter oversaw a simplification of the Russian alphabet, banned arranged marriages, and also changed the Russian calendar to the Julian one. So whilst travelling across Europe, Peter had learned a great deal about navies, how they operate and how to build them. The problem for Peter was that he needed access to a better coast, the Baltic one specifically. One issue, it was controlled by the Swedish Empire. Peter thus made an alliance with Denmark and Saxony, whose leader was also the ruler of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, against Sweden. Together they invaded, and so began the Great Northern War. Denmark near immediately withdrew from the war, allowing Sweden to turn east. Undeterred, Peter clashed with the Swedish at the 1700 Battle of Narva, where he was completely crushed by the better trained and equipped Swedish forces. Sweden hereafter turned its attention to Saxony and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which gave Peter the chance to regroup. He subsequently pushed into the lands of Ingria and Livonia and took this territory. To keep these territorial gains, Peter constructed a fort here and founded a settlement in 1703. St. Petersburg. Over the next 4 years, Sweden managed to stomp Saxony in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and in 1707 its army advanced into Russia. Like so many others in history, the invasion was difficult because winter rolled around, and winter in Russia is very, very cold. Swedish forces retreated down south, and Peter followed, where they clashed at the Battle of Poltava. Here, the Swedish army was decisively beaten. Charles XII fled to the Ottoman Empire, and his army surrendered shortly afterwards. Peter demanded that the Ottomans hand Charles over, which they said no to, and so, more war. Fortunately for Russia, Denmark and Poland-Lithuania had re-entered the war. Unfortunately for Russia, the Ottoman army was incredibly formidable, and Peter's recent gains down south were lost in 1711. The year after this defeat, Peter made a monumental decision. He moved the capital of the Tsardom from Moscow to St. Petersburg, because again, he didn't care for the old ways. Even though he was at war, Peter still wished to reform his kingdom, but there were many opponents to this reform, not least was his son and heir to the throne, Alexis. Alexis had been raised by some boyars, many of whom resented Peter's reforms, and he grew up to despise his father. When, in 1716, Peter wanted Alexis to join him on campaign, Alexis fled to Austria, which made Peter look pretty bad. In 1718, Alexis returned after his father had agreed that he wouldn't be punished, and shortly after this, Peter had Alexis tortured to death for embarrassing him. Peter then changed the rules of succession from my nearest relative gets it to I get to pick who's next. Beyond filicide, Peter had introduced widespread modernizing reforms in areas like justice, religion, and of course, the military. In terms of justice, Peter banned lawyers from courtrooms because, and I'm not kidding here, they talk too much. Judges also weren't permitted to make new rulings because in Peter's Russia, only legislators could interpret law, and there was only one legislator, Peter. As for the military, Peter is often seen as the founder of the Russian Navy. By 1720, Russia's Baltic fleet was larger than the entire Swedish Navy. This was quite impressive considering that in 1710 Russia didn't have a single naval vessel. In terms of religious reform, Peter decided in 1721 to abolish the position of Patriarch of Moscow and replace it with the Holy Synod. This was basically a council of men whom he could bully into doing what he wanted. 1721 was a pretty big year for both Peter and Russia. First of all, the Great Northern War ended in a Russian victory and saw Russia gain all of this territory. Having control over this, Russia's position in Europe and that of Peter was much more prestigious. As such, Peter decided that his title of Tsar wasn't fancy enough, and he declared his new title to be Imperator, or Emperor, and the Tsardom of Russia was now the Russian Empire. In 1722, Peter created his table of ranks, whereby people's rank in society was ideally no longer to be determined by birth, but now how useful they were. This saw many sons of boyars lose favour, and some new men, i.e. nobly born people who worked for the government, rise up the ranks. Peter, in 1723, also freed all of the household slaves in Russia, and made them serfs. Peter's transformative reign would come to an end in 1725 when he died, and so it was time for his appointed heir to take over. Oh wait, he didn't pick one, and so decades of succession disputes and turmoil, which culminated in Catherine the Great. But that's for another time. So Peter the Great's legacy is undeniably important, but also deeply complex and controversial. His reign, which only happened because the stars aligned, took Russia from being a kingdom on the other side of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth to an empire that nobody could ignore. He laid the foundations for Russia's rise to great power status and deprived that same status from Sweden. He was responsible for many sensible reforms that modernized the Russian system.
Oops, didn't mean to end that. Peter the Great was important and had a lot of importance for the expansion of Russia, left a lot of effects along with that. And Catherine the Great came in and took it even further. So this is basically what we see when we look at Russia and the steps of the Siberia and the beginning of the Russian Empire.